The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Marcus Wellington, a wealthy businessman from New York who had made his fortune in tech startups. His designer clothes and expensive watch marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way in life. Marcus had arrived in London 3 days earlier with his wife Sarah and their 2 teenage children for what he called a proper European vacation. He had booked the most expensive suites, hired private drivers, and made reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants. Money was never an issue for Marcus, and he expected the world to bend to his wishes wherever he went. Standing near the palace gates, Marcus grew increasingly impatient as the crowd thickened around him. He was used to VIP treatment and exclusive access, but here he was, just another tourist among hundreds. The red uniformed guards stood motionless at their posts, their iconic bearskin hats making them appear even taller and more imposing. "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered to his wife. "We should have VIP access." "Do you know how much money I spend on vacations like this?" Sarah tried to calm him down, knowing her husband's temper could flare when things didn't go according to his plans. "Marcus, just enjoy the experience. It's a tradition that goes back centuries." But Marcus wasn't interested in tradition or patience. He pulled out his phone and began making calls, trying to reach contacts who might be able to get him special access. When those attempts failed, his frustration grew even more intense. The crowd pressed closer as the ceremony time approached. A group of excited schoolchildren squeezed past Marcus, accidentally bumping into him. Their teacher apologized profusely, but Marcus was already in a foul mood. "Watch where you're going," he snapped at the children, causing several other tourists to look in his direction with disapproval. Standing directly in front of Marcus was Royal Guard James Mitchell, a 28-year-old soldier who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. James had been performing ceremonial duties for 3 years and had seen every type of tourist behavior imaginable. He remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, embodying the discipline and professionalism expected of the Queen's Guard. Marcus studied the guard's stoic face and felt his anger building. Here was someone who was ignoring him completely, showing him no deference despite his obvious wealth and status. In Marcus's world, everyone from hotel managers to restaurant owners went out of their way to please him. This silent, unmoving soldier represented everything that frustrated him about situations he couldn't control with money. "Hey, soldier boy," Marcus called out, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "I'm talking to you." James remained motionless, his training taking over. Guards were instructed to maintain their composure regardless of tourist behavior. He had dealt with people trying to get reactions before, tourists making faces, telling jokes, even trying to touch the guards. But something in this man's tone was different, more aggressive and entitled. The crowd around them began to notice the tension. Some tourists pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual might be about to happen. Sarah tugged on her husband's arm, trying to guide him away from the situation. "Marcus, let's move to a different spot. The ceremony will start soon." But Marcus shrugged off his wife's hand. He was fixated on the guard now, seeing him as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with his morning. The lack of special treatment, the crowds, the waiting, it all focused into resentment toward this one person who wouldn't even acknowledge his presence. "I said I'm talking to you," Marcus repeated, stepping closer to James. "Don't you know how to show respect to visitors?" An elderly British gentleman nearby cleared his throat disapprovingly. "Sir, the guards are not permitted to speak during their duty." Marcus whirled around to face the man. "I wasn't talking to you, old man. Mind your own business." The crowd was growing uncomfortable now. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people began to step back, creating a small circle around Marcus and the guard. The atmosphere that had been festive and excited just minutes before was now tense and awkward. James could feel the situation escalating, but his training held firm. He had been taught to remain professional regardless of provocation. His commanding officers had drilled into him and his fellow guards that they represented not just the military, but the entire nation. Every tourist interaction was a reflection of British values and discipline. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick roll of cash, peeling off several £100 notes. He held them up toward James's face. "Maybe this will get your attention," he said loudly enough for everyone around to hear. I bet you don't make in a month what I spend on lunch." The crowd gasped at the display. Several British tourists began muttering angrily among themselves about the Americans' behavior. A few started recording with their phones, sensing that this confrontation was building toward something significant. Sarah was mortified by her husband's behavior. She had seen him be demanding with service staff before, but never anything this public or aggressive. Their teenage children had disappeared into the crowd, embarrassed by their father's scene. "Marcus, please," she whispered urgently. "People are watching. You're making a scene." But Marcus was beyond caring about appearances. His ego had taken over completely, and the guard's continued silence only fueled his rage. He waved the money closer to James's face, the bills almost touching the soldier's nose. "What's wrong with you people?" Marcus shouted. "Don't you understand that money talks? I could buy and sell you 10 times over." James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his position. Inside, he was drawing on every ounce of his military training and personal discipline. He thought about his duty, his oath, and the respect he had for the institution he represented. But he was also human, and the insults were hitting their mark. The crowd had grown larger now, with people pushing forward to see what was happening. Some were openly filming, and others were calling for security. The tension was building toward a breaking point that would soon shock everyone present. The morning air grew thick with tension as Marcus Wellington's voice carried across the palace courtyard. More tourists were gathering now, drawn by the commotion. Many held up their phones, instinctively knowing they were witnessing something that would likely go viral on social media. Palace security had noticed the disturbance and were making their way through the crowd, but the dense pack of tourists made their progress slow. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his verbal assault on guard James Mitchell, who remained frozen in his ceremonial position. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Marcus demanded, his face reddening with anger. He began waving his handful of cash more aggressively, the bills fluttering in the morning breeze. "In America, we know how to treat our military with respect, but we also expect respect in return." An elderly war veteran in the crowd wearing his service medals spoke up with a shaky but firm voice. "Young man, this soldier is doing his duty. He serves the crown with honor. You should show some respect." Marcus spun around to face the veteran, his eyes blazing. "Respect? I'm showing him plenty of respect by offering him more money than he'll see in years, but he's too stuck up to even acknowledge me." The veteran's face hardened. "Son, I fought in wars so people could be free, but freedom doesn't mean acting like a fool in public." Other voices in the crowd began joining in, creating a chorus of disapproval directed at Marcus. British tourists, in particular, were outraged by his treatment of their ceremonial guard. Comments like "disgraceful" and "typical American" began rippling through the gathering. Sarah Wellington stood frozen with embarrassment, watching her husband's behavior spiral completely out of control. She had married Marcus 15 years ago when he was still building his first company, and she remembered the ambitious but kinder man he used to be. Success and wealth had changed him over the years, making him increasingly demanding and entitled. But she had never seen him this publicly aggressive before. Their teenage son Tyler had managed to push through the crowd to reach his mother. "Mom, we need to get Dad out of here," he whispered urgently. "Everyone's filming this. It's going to be all over the internet." James Mitchell could hear every word being said around him, but his training kept him perfectly still. Inside his mind, however, a storm was brewing. He thought about his fellow soldiers who had died in combat, about the honor and sacrifice that the uniform represented, and about his own family's military history going back 3 generations. His grandfather had fought in World War II, surviving the beaches of Normandy. His father had served in the Falklands. James himself had seen combat in Afghanistan, where he had lost friends and nearly lost his own life. The idea that some wealthy tourist thought he could buy his dignity with a handful of cash was more insulting than anything he had experienced in his military career. Marcus stepped even closer to James, close enough that his breath was visible in the cool morning air. The crowd pressed in around them, creating an almost arena-like atmosphere. Some tourists were actively encouraging security to intervene, while others seemed mesmerized by the developing confrontation. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. You people think you're better than everyone else because of your fancy uniforms and your traditions. But at the end of the day, you're just employees. And I'm the customer." A young British woman in the crowd couldn't contain herself any longer. "He's not your employee, you absolute muppet," she shouted. "He's serving his country." Marcus whirled toward her. "Oh, serving his country? By standing around like a statue for tourists to take pictures with? My tax dollars probably pay more toward NATO than his entire salary." The crowd's anger was reaching a boiling point. Someone shouted, "Get him out of here," while another voice called for the police. A group of teenagers began chanting, "Shame, shame," in unison, their voices carrying across the palace grounds. Palace security was finally pushing through the crowd, but they were still several people away from reaching the confrontation. The guards could see what was happening and were speaking into their radios, calling for backup and additional crowd control. Marcus seemed to feed off the crowd's reaction, interpreting their anger as attention and excitement. In his twisted logic, he was the center of a dramatic scene, and that felt better than being ignored. He pulled out his phone with his free hand and began recording himself. "This is Marcus Wellington reporting live from Buckingham Palace, where I'm trying to have a civilized conversation with one of the Queen's guards, but apparently they don't know how to treat American visitors with respect." The absurdity of filming himself while harassing a guard sent the crowd's anger to new heights. Someone threw a crumpled paper cup in Marcus's direction, though it fell short. Others began booing loudly, and the sound echoed off the palace walls. Sarah finally found the courage to act. She pushed through the people separating her from her husband and grabbed his arm firmly. "Marcus, stop this right now. You're embarrassing our family and our country." For a moment, Marcus seemed to recognize his wife's voice and the genuine distress in it. He looked around at the sea of angry faces surrounding him, at the dozens of phones recording his every word and gesture, but instead of backing down, his ego doubled down. "You want a show?" he shouted to the crowd. "Fine, I'll give you a show." He stepped directly in front of James, so close that they were nearly touching. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but everyone could see the tension in his jaw and the slight trembling in his hands that betrayed the effort it was taking to maintain his composure. Marcus raised the cash up to James's eye level. "Last chance, soldier boy. All you have to do is acknowledge that I exist. Just one word. Just look at me. That's all it takes to earn this money and end this whole thing." The crowd held its collective breath. Security was almost close enough to intervene, but not quite there yet. Sarah was pulling on Marcus's other arm, begging him to stop. The entire scene had taken on an almost surreal quality, with hundreds of people watching one man's complete loss of control in one of the most sacred spaces in British culture. James Mitchell stood at the center of it all, every muscle in his body taut with the effort of maintaining his professional composure, while his personal dignity was being systematically attacked by someone who viewed him as nothing more than a tourist attraction to be bought and manipulated. The breaking point was seconds away. The moment that would shock the world happened in slow motion. Marcus Wellington, his face twisted with rage and entitlement, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As hundreds of tourists watched in horror, he drew back and spat directly into the face of Royal Guard James Mitchell. The thick glob of saliva struck James on his left cheek and began sliding down toward his pristine red uniform. For a split second, the entire courtyard fell into stunned silence. Even the pigeons seemed to stop cooing as the gravity of what had just happened sank in. The crowd erupted simultaneously, gasps of shock mixed with cries of outrage as dozens of voices began shouting at once. "Oh my God. Did he just... That's absolutely disgusting. What is wrong with this man?" James Mitchell stood frozen, feeling the warm saliva on his face but unable to move to wipe it away. His training screamed at him to maintain his position, but every human instinct told him to react. His hands trembled slightly as he fought the most intense internal battle of his life. Sarah Wellington screamed and stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. "Marcus, what have you done?" She couldn't believe her husband was capable of something so vile and degrading. The British tourists in the crowd were beside themselves with fury. An elderly gentleman pushed forward, his walking stick raised. "You absolute disgrace. How dare you?" A group of university students began chanting, "Out! Out! Out!" while pointing at Marcus. Palace security finally broke through the crowd. but they too seemed momentarily stunned by what they had witnessed. Sergeant Williams, a 15-year veteran of palace security, had seen every conceivable type of tourist behavior, but nothing had prepared him for this level of disrespect. Marcus seemed shocked by his own actions. For the first time since the confrontation began, he appeared to realize the magnitude of what he had done. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything he had experienced, and the look of pure hatred on dozens of faces finally penetrated his entitled bubble. He wasn't, Marcus stammered, trying to form words that might somehow justify his actions. But there was no justification, and everyone present knew it. James Mitchell made a decision that would define his character forever. Still maintaining his ceremonial position, he slowly and deliberately moved his eyes to look directly at Marcus for the first time. The guard's gaze was steady, dignified, and filled with a quiet strength that commanded respect from everyone who saw it. Without breaking eye contact, James spoke in a clear, measured voice that carried across the silent courtyard. "Sir, I serve my queen and country with honor. Nothing you can do will ever change that." The simple statement hit the crowd like an electric shock. Spontaneous applause began from somewhere in the back, and quickly spread throughout the gathering. People began cheering and clapping for the guard who had shown such incredible restraint and dignity in the face of degrading treatment. Marcus stood there with his mouth hanging open, the cash still clutched in his hand as he realized that the guard's first and only words had completely destroyed any moral high ground he thought he might have had. The soldier had shown more class and character in one sentence than Marcus had displayed in his entire adult life. Palace security moved in quickly now, surrounding Marcus but not yet touching him. "Sir, you need to come with us immediately," Sergeant Williams commanded in a tone that brooked no argument. "Wait, I can explain." Marcus started, but his words were drowned out by the crowd's continued applause for the guard. Several tourists had formed a protective semicircle around James, as if shielding him from further harassment. A well-dressed British woman stepped forward and offered James her handkerchief. "May I?" she asked gently. James gave a slight nod, and she carefully wiped the saliva from his face with the tenderness one might show a wounded hero. "Thank you for your service," she said quietly. "You represent the very best of Britain." The crowd heard her words and erupted in another round of applause. Someone started singing "God Save the Queen," and soon dozens of voices joined in. The patriotic song created a powerful counterpoint to the ugliness of what had just transpired. Marcus's children had witnessed the entire episode and were crying with shame. Tyler, his 16-year-old son, pushed through the crowd to confront his father. "Dad, how could you do something so horrible?" "He's a soldier." Even in his confused state, Marcus could see the disappointment and disgust in his own son's eyes. The boy he had raised and provided for was looking at him like he was a stranger, someone whose values and character were completely foreign. Security began moving Marcus toward the palace gates, but the crowd followed, their voices growing louder and more unified in their condemnation. Someone had started a chant of "Shame on you" that spread like wildfire through the gathering. News photographers and professional journalists who regularly covered royal events were pushing through the crowd, their cameras clicking rapidly. They knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment that would define discussions about respect, dignity, and national pride. Marcus tried one last time to address the crowd, perhaps thinking he could somehow salvage the situation with words. "Look, I just wanted some respect. I'm an American citizen and I demand—" His words were cut off by a chorus of boos so loud that pigeons scattered from the palace roofs. Someone shouted, "Americans should be ashamed of you," while another voice called out, "You don't represent Americans, you represent yourself." As security escorted Marcus away from the crowd, he turned back to look at James Mitchell one more time. The guard had resumed his ceremonial position, staring straight ahead, but the handkerchief that had cleaned his face was tucked respectfully into his uniform pocket. The image of that small white cloth became a symbol of dignity restored, of human kindness triumphing over cruelty, and of the quiet strength that defines true character. Marcus realized in that moment that he had just lost a confrontation he never should have started, against an opponent who had won without ever fighting back. The crowd continued to cheer for James as Marcus disappeared through the palace gates, escorted by security. But the story was far from over, and the consequences were just beginning to unfold. Within minutes of Marcus Wellington being escorted away by palace security, the digital age took over. The dozens of smartphones that had captured the incident began uploading videos to every social media platform imaginable. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube were suddenly flooded with multiple angles of the same shocking scene. The first video to go viral was filmed by Emma Thompson, a 22-year-old university student from Manchester. Her phone had captured the entire sequence from Marcus's initial aggressive behavior to the moment he spat on the guard, and finally, James Mitchell's dignified response. She posted it with the simple caption, "This is how you don't treat our soldiers. Respect to this guard for showing true British class." Within 2 hours, Emma's video had been viewed over 500,000 times and shared by thousands of accounts. The comments section became a battlefield of outrage, with people from around the world expressing their disgust at Marcus's behavior and their admiration for the guard's restraint. Meanwhile, in a secure office within Buckingham Palace, Marcus sat across from Detective Inspector Sarah Clark of the Metropolitan Police and Colonel James Harrison, the commanding officer of the Queen's Guard. The room was spartanly furnished with just a table, chairs, and portraits of the royal family looking down from the walls. "Mr. Wellington," Detective Inspector Clark began, "you are being investigated for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. Spitting on someone constitutes assault under British law." Marcus, who had been sitting in stunned silence since being brought inside, finally found his voice. "Assault? It was just—" I was frustrated. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Colonel Harrison leaned forward, his decades of military experience evident in his bearing. "Mr. Wellington, my guards undergo extensive training to deal with difficult situations. They show remarkable restraint daily, but what you did crossed every line of human decency." "I want to call my lawyer," Marcus said, finally grasping the seriousness of his situation, "and the American embassy." "I'm an American citizen," Detective Inspector Clark nodded. "You have that right. But first, let me explain exactly what happened here today. You assaulted a British soldier in front of hundreds of witnesses while he was performing his duty. The incident was recorded from multiple angles. This isn't going away." Outside the palace, the crowd had largely dispersed, but a core group of supporters remained near James Mitchell's post. People were bringing flowers, handwritten notes, and small British flags. An impromptu memorial to dignity and service was forming around the guard's position. James continued his duty, maintaining his ceremonial stance, but inside he was processing the morning's events. He thought about his training, about the values instilled in him by his military service, and about how he had managed to maintain his composure in such an extreme situation. Back in the interrogation room, Marcus was beginning to understand the full scope of his situation. Detective Inspector Clark had shown him some of the social media posts that were already circulating, and the universal condemnation was overwhelming. "This is my life," Marcus said quietly, staring at his phone screen showing tweet after tweet calling him everything from disgusting to a disgrace to America. "My business, my reputation, it's all ruined." "Mr. Wellington," Colonel Harrison said with military directness, "actions have consequences. Today you chose to degrade a soldier who has served his country honorably. The consequences of that choice belong entirely to you." Marcus's lawyer rushed over from his London office, arrived within the hour. Richard Pemberton was a high-powered attorney who specialized in crisis management for wealthy clients. He took one look at the situation and knew this would be the most challenging case of his career. "Marcus, we need to discuss damage control immediately," Pemberton said, after reviewing the evidence. "The videos are everywhere. CNN, BBC, Fox News. Every major outlet is picking up the story. Indeed, news organizations around the world were scrambling to cover what was being called the palace spitting incident. The story had everything: wealth, entitlement, tradition, dignity, and a shocking moment of human cruelty contrasted with remarkable restraint. Sarah Wellington had taken the children back to their hotel, where they huddled in their suite, trying to process what had happened. Tyler, the 16-year-old son, was scrolling through social media and watching his father become one of the most hated people on the internet. "Mom, kids at school are going to see this forever," he said, tears streaming down his face. How could Dad do something so awful? Their 14-year-old daughter Jessica was even more distraught. "Everyone's going to know who we are. Our faces are in some of those videos too. Sarah tried to comfort her children while dealing with her own shock and embarrassment. She had married Marcus when he was ambitious but kind. Success had gradually changed him, making him more demanding and entitled. But she had never imagined he was capable of such public cruelty. Back at the palace, the afternoon changing of the guard ceremony was drawing unprecedented crowds. Word had spread about the morning's incident, and people were coming specifically to show support for the guards. The atmosphere was electric with patriotic pride and solidarity. James Mitchell's shift was ending, but as he prepared to march off duty, something extraordinary happened. The crowd began applauding spontaneously. What started as scattered clapping grew into thunderous applause that echoed off the palace walls. Tourists and locals alike were on their feet, some wiping away tears as they showed their appreciation for a soldier who had endured degrading treatment with such dignity. Signs had appeared in the crowd: "We support our guards, dignity over money, and true British values." As James marched off duty with his fellow guards, the crowd's applause continued. Children waved small British flags, elderly veterans saluted, and people of all ages cheered for soldiers who represented the best of their nation's character. In his hotel room, Marcus watched the news coverage with growing horror. Every major network was covering the story, and the narrative was unanimously against him. He wasn't just being portrayed as an individual who had behaved badly. He was being held up as a symbol of everything wrong with entitled wealth and disrespect for service. His phone rang constantly with calls from business, associates, friends, and reporters. His assistant had quit via text message. His company's stock price was beginning to drop as investors distanced themselves from the scandal. "This can't be happening," Marcus muttered to himself, but the evidence was undeniable. He had created a moment that would define him forever, and there was no way to take it back. The story was far from over, and the repercussions were just beginning to ripple out across the world. By the next morning, Marcus Wellington's name was trending worldwide on every social media platform. The hashtags #PalaceSpitter, Respect Our Guards, and British Dignity were being shared millions of times. The story had transcended borders, becoming a global conversation about respect, privilege, and human decency. Major news networks were dedicating entire segments to the incident. CNN's Anderson Cooper opened his show by saying, "Tonight, we examine how one moment of entitled rage became a symbol of everything wrong with wealth without wisdom." The BBC ran a special feature titled, "The Guard Who Showed Us Grace Under Fire." Marcus sat in his London hotel suite, effectively trapped. Reporters had gathered outside the hotel, and paparazzi were offering substantial sums for photos of his family. His children couldn't leave their rooms without being photographed and questioned about their father's behavior. The business consequences were swift and devastating. Wellington Tech Solutions, Marcus's primary company, saw its stock price plummet by 35% in the first day of trading after the incident. 3 major clients had already canceled contracts, citing reputational concerns and not wanting to be associated with the scandal. Marcus's phone buzzed with a call from his business partner and longtime friend, David Chen. The conversation was brief and brutal. "Marcus, the board met this morning," David said without preamble. "We're asking for your resignation as CEO. This scandal is destroying everything we've built." "David, you can't be serious." "It was one mistake. One moment of bad judgment. One moment." David's voice was incredulous. "Marcus, you spat on a soldier in public while representing our company. The damage control alone would cost millions, and even then, we might never recover our reputation." The call ended with Marcus being given 48 hours to submit his resignation or face a public board vote to remove him. 20 years of building his business empire was crumbling because of 2 minutes of uncontrolled anger. Meanwhile, James Mitchell had become an unexpected hero. The Ministry of Defense was being flooded with messages of support from around the world. Veterans organizations were praising his restraint and professionalism. A GoFundMe campaign started by strangers to buy the dignified guard a pint had already raised over $50,000. James himself was struggling with the sudden attention. In an interview with his commanding officer, he expressed his discomfort with being called a hero. "Sir, I was just doing my job," James told Colonel Harrison. Any guard would have responded the same way. "James," the colonel replied, "what you showed yesterday wasn't just training. It was character." In a moment when most people would have reacted with anger, you responded with dignity. That's leadership. The royal family was also taking notice. Palace sources, speaking anonymously, indicated that the Queen herself had been briefed on the incident and was considering a personal commendation for James's conduct. Back in Marcus's world, the destruction continued. His wife Sarah had called her divorce attorney. She couldn't reconcile the man who had spat on a soldier with the person she had married. The children were being bullied online and had received death threats from strangers who had seen the videos. "I don't know who you are anymore," Sarah told Marcus during a tense conversation in their hotel suite. "The man I married would never have done something so cruel and degrading." Marcus tried to explain his actions, but every word sounded hollow and self-serving. "I was frustrated. I felt disrespected. I didn't plan for it to happen." "You didn't plan to spit on someone?" Sarah's voice was filled with disgust. "Marcus, that's not something that happens by accident. That came from somewhere deep inside you, and I don't want to be married to someone capable of that level of cruelty." The international reaction was equally harsh. The American embassy in London issued a statement distancing the U.S. government from Marcus's actions. "The behavior displayed by Mr. Wellington does not represent American values or respect for our British allies and their honored traditions." Social media had become a tribunal of public opinion, and Marcus was being tried and convicted in the court of global outrage. Memes mocking his entitled behavior spread like wildfire. Late-night talk show hosts made him the subject of opening monologues. Even celebrities were weighing in with condemnations, but perhaps the most devastating reaction came from his own family. Marcus's elderly father, a Korean War veteran, called from Florida with a message that cut deeper than any public criticism. "Son, I taught you better than this," the old man said, his voice shaking with disappointment. "I served my country with pride, and I raised you to respect those who serve. What you did to that soldier, I'm ashamed to call you my son." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His father had never spoken to him with such disappointment and anger. The man who had taught him to work hard, to build something meaningful, was now publicly disowning his actions. Meanwhile, the support for James Mitchell continued to grow. Military families from around the world were sharing stories about the dignity and sacrifice of soldiers. The incident had sparked a broader conversation about respect for those who serve their countries. A group of British veterans announced they would be holding a dignity march to Buckingham Palace to show support for James and all military personnel. The event was being organized entirely through social media, with thousands of people planning to attend. Marcus's lawyer, Richard Pemberton, was working frantically to manage the crisis, but the damage seemed impossible to contain. Every statement they released was met with more criticism and ridicule. "Marcus, we need to consider a public apology," Pemberton advised during a strategy meeting. "The longer we wait, the worse this gets." But Marcus's pride was still getting in the way of his judgment. "An apology admits guilt. If I apologize, I'm accepting that I'm the villain in this story." "Marcus," Pemberton said bluntly, "you are the villain in this story. The entire world has seen you spit on a soldier. There's no spinning that into something positive." As the second day after the incident ended, Marcus sat alone in his hotel room, watching news coverage of himself being condemned by people from every corner of the globe. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a public relations crisis that would blow over in a few weeks. This was a defining moment that would follow him for the rest of his life, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. 3 days after the incident, Marcus Wellington made a decision that surprised everyone, including his own legal team. He announced he would hold a public press conference to address the situation directly. Against his lawyer's strong advice, he chose to face the media storm head-on. The press conference was held at a small hotel conference room in central London. Dozens of reporters packed into the space, their cameras and microphones creating a forest of recording equipment. The atmosphere was tense, with journalists ready to ask the hard questions that Marcus had been avoiding. Marcus walked to the podium looking exhausted and defeated. The confident businessman who had arrived in London just days earlier was gone, replaced by someone who appeared to have aged years in a matter of hours. His expensive suit couldn't hide the toll that the global condemnation was taking on him. "I want to begin by offering my sincere and unreserved apology to guard James Mitchell," Marcus began, his voice barely steady. "What I did was inexcusable, degrading and completely contrary to everything I was raised to believe about respect and human dignity. The room was silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters. Marcus paused, seeming to gather himself before continuing. I have no excuse for my behavior. I was frustrated, I felt ignored, and I acted in a way that brought shame not only on myself but on my family and my country. Guard Mitchell showed extraordinary professionalism and dignity in a situation where I showed none. A reporter from the BBC immediately raised her hand. Mr. Wellington, many people are calling your apology too little, too late. What do you say to those who believe this is just damage control for your business interests? Marcus looked directly into the camera. My business is destroyed. My marriage is over. My children are ashamed of me, and my father has disowned my actions. If this was about damage control, I've already failed completely. This is about trying to do the one right thing I can still do. Take full responsibility for my actions. The honesty in his response seemed to catch some reporters off guard. They had expected deflection or excuses, not this level of self-awareness about the consequences he was facing. Another journalist pressed further. What prompted such an extreme reaction? Spitting on someone isn't something that happens in a moment of minor frustration. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice cracked slightly. I've spent the last 20 years building wealth and believing that money could solve any problem or open any door. When I encountered someone who couldn't be bought, who maintained his dignity regardless of what I offered, it challenged everything I thought I understood about the world. Instead of respecting that dignity, I tried to destroy it. That says everything about who I had become, and nothing about Guard Mitchell's character. A veteran reporter from CNN asked the question everyone was thinking. Do you believe you deserve forgiveness for this? No, Marcus answered immediately. I don't deserve forgiveness. I hope someday I might earn it through my actions, but right now I deserve exactly the condemnation I'm receiving. Guard Mitchell and the British people have every right to be disgusted by what I did. Meanwhile, across London, James Mitchell was watching the press conference from the guards' quarters at Wellington Barracks. His fellow soldiers had gathered around the television, curious to see how the man who had humiliated their colleague would handle the global scrutiny. He actually looked sorry, one guard commented. James nodded slowly. Maybe, but sorry doesn't undo what happened. Colonel Harrison joined the group. James, how do you feel about his apology? James considered the question carefully. Sir, he's saying the right words now. But where was this understanding when he was waving money in my face? It's easy to be humble when the whole world is watching you fail. Back at the press conference, Marcus was fielding increasingly difficult questions. A reporter from The Guardian asked about the impact on his family. My wife filed for divorce yesterday, Marcus admitted. My children are receiving threats from strangers online. My 16-year-old son told me he's ashamed to have my name. These are consequences I created, and they're consequences my family doesn't deserve. The raw emotion in his voice was undeniable. Sarah Wellington, watching from their hotel room, felt a flicker of the compassion that had originally drawn her to Marcus years ago. But it was too late for their marriage. The man who could spit on a soldier wasn't someone she could trust with her heart or her children's future. A reporter asked about his business losses. Wellington Tech Solutions lost 40% of its value in 3 days. How do you respond to investors who trusted you with their money? I've submitted my resignation as CEO, Marcus announced, shocking his own legal team. The company deserves leadership that isn't tainted by my actions. I'm also liquidating my personal holdings to establish a fund for military families and veterans organizations. It won't repair the damage I've done, but it might help people who deserve support. This announcement created a buzz in the room. Several reporters immediately began typing on their phones, sending breaking news alerts about Marcus's resignation and pledged to donate his wealth. Richard Pemberton, Marcus's lawyer, looked stunned. They hadn't discussed this level of financial sacrifice, and he wondered if his client was making decisions out of genuine remorse or complete desperation. The press conference continued for another 30 minutes, with Marcus answering every question directly and accepting full responsibility for his actions. He didn't blame jet lag, stress, or cultural differences. He owned his behavior completely. As the session ended, Marcus made one final statement. I want to close by saying that Guard James Mitchell represented the very best of British values and military service. He showed strength, dignity, and professionalism in the face of degrading treatment. I hope that people remember his character rather than my failure. He is the hero of this story, not its villain. The press conference ended, but its impact was immediate. Social media reactions were mixed for the first time since the incident began. While many people remained furious with Marcus, others were surprised by his complete acceptance of responsibility and his willingness to sacrifice his wealth in an attempt at making amends. The story was entering a new phase, one where the lines between villain and victim were becoming more complex, and where the possibility of redemption, however distant, was being discussed for the first time. But the ultimate judgment would come from the one person whose opinion mattered most, guard James Mitchell himself. 2 weeks after the incident that shocked the world, an unexpected meeting was arranged. Palace officials, after consultation with the highest levels of government, decided that guard James Mitchell and Marcus Wellington should meet face to face. The meeting would be private, with no cameras or reporters present. The setting was a small, quiet room within Wellington Barracks. James arrived first, wearing his dress uniform but without his ceremonial bearskin hat. He sat quietly, his hands folded, waiting for the man who had humiliated him in front of hundreds of people. When Marcus entered the room, he looked like a different person entirely. Gone was the arrogant businessman who had demanded attention at Buckingham Palace. In his place was a man who had lost everything: his business, his marriage, his children's respect, and his public reputation. He wore a simple black suit and carried himself with the weight of someone who had truly understood the magnitude of his mistakes. "Guard Mitchell," Marcus said quietly, stopping several feet away and not attempting to offer a handshake. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know I have no right to ask for your time." James studied the man before him. The blustering, entitled tourist was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely broken by the consequences of his actions. "Mr. Wellington," James replied formally, "I agreed to this meeting because my commanding officers thought it might be beneficial. But I want you to understand, I'm not here to make you feel better about what you did." Marcus nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to. I'm here because I needed to apologize to you personally, not through a press conference or a lawyer's statement, but face-to-face, man-to-man." "Go ahead then," James said, his voice neutral but not hostile. Marcus took a deep breath. "Guard Mitchell, what I did to you was the most shameful act of my life. I degraded you, I disrespected your service, and I treated you as less than human. You were doing your duty, serving your country with honor, and I repaid that with cruelty and contempt." James listened without interruption, watching Marcus's face carefully. He had seen genuine remorse before, during his military service, when soldiers had made serious mistakes that harmed their comrades. This felt similar, but he remained cautious. "I've lost everything because of that moment," Marcus continued, "and I deserve to lose it all. But what haunts me isn't what I lost. It's what I revealed about who I had become. I was raised by a veteran who taught me to respect those who serve. Somewhere along the way, I forgot those lessons and became someone my younger self would have despised. What do you want from me?" James asked directly. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Nothing. I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just needed you to know that I understand the full weight of what I did, and that I'm spending the rest of my life trying to make amends for it." James leaned forward slightly. "You mentioned making amends. What does that look like?" "I've donated my entire fortune to veterans organizations and military family support group," Marcus replied. "Every penny from my business interests, my properties, my investments, it's all going to help people who serve and their families. It won't undo what I did to you, but maybe it will help people who deserve support." James was surprised by this information, though he didn't show it. He had heard about some donations in the news, but he hadn't realized the extent of Marcus's financial sacrifice. "I've also been working with schools in America," Marcus continued, "talking to young people about respect, consequences, and the importance of military service. I tell them my story as a warning about what happens when you let wealth and privilege corrupt your character." For the first time since the incident, James saw something in Marcus that reminded him of the dignity that should define all human beings. The arrogant tourist was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to genuinely understand the gravity of his actions and was trying to do something meaningful about it. "Mr. Wellington," James said slowly, "I appreciate you coming here to apologize in person. That took courage, knowing how people feel about you." Marcus shook his head. "It wasn't courage. It was the least I could do. You showed real courage that morning at the palace. You maintained your dignity and professionalism when I was trying to destroy both. You represented everything good about military service, and I represented everything wrong with entitled privilege. The two men sat in silence for a moment. Finally, James spoke again. I won't pretend that what you did was acceptable. It wasn't. And I won't pretend that your apologies erase the humiliation of that morning. They don't. Marcus nodded, accepting the judgment. But, James continued, I can see that you've changed. The man sitting here today isn't the same person who spat on me 2 weeks ago. That gives me hope that people can learn from their mistakes, even terrible ones. Does that mean you forgive me? Marcus asked quietly. James considered the question carefully. I think forgiveness is something that happens over time, through actions rather than words. What you've done since that morning, the donations, the school visits, the willingness to face public humiliation, those are the actions of someone who's genuinely sorry. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes. I know I can't undo what I did, but I promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor the lesson you taught me that morning. What lesson was that? James asked. That true dignity can't be bought, threatened, or destroyed by someone else's cruelty. You showed me what real strength looks like, the kind that comes from character rather than wealth. James stood up and, for the first time, extended his hand to Marcus. Mr. Wellington, I hope you find peace with yourself and continue trying to make amends. The man I'm talking to now has the potential to do a lot of good in the world. Marcus shook James's hand, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Thank you, Guard Mitchell, for your service, for your dignity that morning, and for giving me a chance to apologize properly. As Marcus left Wellington Barracks that afternoon, he knew his life would never return to what it had been. His marriage was over, his business empire was gone, and his reputation would forever be tied to one moment of terrible judgment. But for the first time since that morning at Buckingham Palace, he felt like he might be able to build something better from the ruins of his old life. The incident that had started with one man's entitled rage and another man's dignified restraint had become a story about the possibility of redemption, the power of genuine remorse, and the truth that character is revealed not in moments of comfort, but in times of testing. Guard James Mitchell returned to his duties, forever changed by an encounter that had shown him both the worst and best of human nature, and Marcus Wellington began the long journey of trying to earn back not his wealth or status, but something far more valuable, his own self-respect and the right to call himself a good man.